Hi folks, a lot of you have been asking about my political stances lately. I've been seeing a ton of comments from people saying things like, weren't you on the left, or asking why it seems like I've made such a sudden shift. For some of you, it feels like I've done a complete 180 overnight. And I get it. It might look that way on the surface. People are curious, and I understand why. So I think it's about time we have this conversation. Let me set the record straight. This shift wasn't sudden. It was the culmination of self-reflection, observations, conversations, research, prayer, and a complete reevaluation of my values, what I stand for, and where I want to be and go with my life. All that being said, let's start at the very beginning. I grew up in Brazil, a country with a multi-party political system. Now, while there were clear divisions between political ideologies, there was no clear equivalent of Democrats versus Republicans, though polarization still existed. Political affiliation wasn't as entrenched in personal identity as it is often in the US, at least not when I was growing up. Back then, political identity in Brazil was less about loyalty to a party and more about the principles you stood for. As a kid, I'd say I was more of a centrist, a moderate. I didn't really understand the ideological divides at the time, but I developed a habit that laid the groundwork for my curiosity. Every morning, my mom would drop me off at school an hour early to avoid São Paulo's infamous traffic. I'd sit in the library and kill time reading newspapers and magazines. I read both leftist and right-wing publications, and even though I wasn't aware of the political lines, I noticed that different papers cover the same events in wildly different ways. What started as a way to stave off boredom gradually began to feed my perspective. In college, I kept that habit of arriving early and reading in the library, but this time it was part of a much bigger shift in my life. I was in the film program, and the first year focused heavily on Marxist and socialist philosophers. Walter Benjamin, Adorno, Horkheimer, and the Frankfurt School, you name it, I read it. That period radicalized me. I dove deep into anti-capitalistic rebellion, but it was rebellion without the awareness of my privileged place in society. Add to that a performative sense of radical empathy, and I basically embodied the same kind of righteousness backed by ideological fallacies you'd expect from someone like Luigi Mangione, rich, angry at the world, and blaming society for all that anger. Around this time, I started taking the public bus to college, which was about a 90-minute trip each way. I used that time to read everything I could get my hands on: Greek mythology, Shakespeare, and yes, even Mein Kampf. Now let me be clear. I didn't read Mein Kampf because I sympathized with Hitler or endorsed his views. Part of studying Marx and the Frankfurt School in my college involved learning how socialists and communists were also persecuted by the Nazis. Reading Hitler's book felt like the logical conclusion to understanding what led him to do what he did ideologically. What stood out to me about his writings were two things: the overwhelming anger in his tone and the way his writing dripped with a sense of righteous motivation. It didn't inspire me. It made me realize how dangerous that kind of ideology can be when it's fueled by unchecked rage and delusion. At the time, I guess you could say I'd gone full-blown socialist and on some issues even communist. I briefly got involved in politics, primarily with PMDB, which was sort of like the Democratic Party of Brazil. I wasn't anti-democracy, far from it. I grew up in a post-dictatorship Brazil, a country still grappling with generational failures and severe financial struggles resulting from years of failed inflation control policies, a dead currency, and the disastrous color plan. Poverty was an issue you couldn't ignore. Every spotlight had children and adults begging for money, and the favelas were ever expanding. These conditions shaped my worldview, and I believed expanding the government to help the people was a solution. I was clearly naive. I didn't yet understand how inefficient and corrupt government solutions can be. Now, fast forward to when I moved back to America. This was where I started shaping my understanding of U.S. politics and culture. I was glued to CNN and The Daily Show with Jon Stewart. I thought Jon Stewart was witty, incisive, and doing important work. Stephen Colbert, too. They seemed to be holding a corrupt Republican establishment accountable, especially after the lies that led to the Iraq War. I was such a huge fan of both that I dreamed of doing the kind of work they did eventually in my life. Now, by 2008, I was swept up in Barack Obama's campaign, captivated by the hope and change messaging, the Shepherd Ferry posters, and the promise that Obama represented a sharp break from the warmongering neocons of the Bush era. One of the main reasons I voted for him was his pledge to deliver universal health care. Having grown up in Brazil, I'd seen firsthand how inefficient a government-run healthcare system could be. Most families, including mine, still had to purchase private insurance for adequate care. Now, despite this, I believe the U.S. can make it work. I fully bought into Obama's vision, but looking back now, I can see where I was naive. Around this time, I was so invested in politics that I interned at the local regional office of U.S. Senator George Lemieux in Northeast Florida. Most of my time in his office was spent watching Fox News on the TV they had on, and I didn't learn much more than the fact that old ladies in Florida love to leave voicemails for their senators, hoping they'll do something. My main task was taking notes on what they said and passing them to my supervisor. It was an easy gig, and they were very nice to me. That experience slightly changed my perspective on Republicans. They weren't the boogeymen the media I consumed often portrayed them to be. As far as Obama goes, I became quickly disillusioned. The Affordable Care Act was a major disappointment. It felt like a weak compromise, and I still couldn't afford health insurance, even under his plan. Beyond that, I was deeply frustrated by how much of a warmonger Obama turned out to be. Part of the reason I voted for him, like so many voters, was that he seemed to stand in opposition to Bush's wars. But as his presidency unfolded, it became clear he was just as invested in conflict. It felt like he'd abandoned the ideals he ran on. By 2011, I had moved to New York, and I was still largely on the left. I went down to Occupy Wall Street a few times to see what was happening. I didn't camp out there because I had a place to live, but I was intrigued by the movement. One day, I went to document the protests, and it just so happened to be the day they marched onto the Brooklyn Bridge. That's when things went sideways. I got arrested along with 800 other people. It was not fun, to say the least, but it was an experience that made me reflect on the system and the dynamics of dissent. I went into it with expectations largely shaped by the media narrative around Occupy Wall Street at the time, that the cops were essentially fascist enforcers, the SS, out to crush innocent protesters. I was ready to see aggression and cruelty, but what I encountered was different. Yes, the police did feel authoritative, like bulldogs maintaining control, but most of the ones I interacted with were surprisingly chill. Sitting on the bus after I got arrested, handcuffed, we even joked around with the cops. I remember there were 2 Dominican guys who got arrested with me, and we all teased one of the cops when he admitted he lived in Jersey. On the other hand, my interactions with the protesters left me feeling cynical. I had expected to see purpose, solidarity, and focus on real change. Instead, what I got felt performative and entitled. The protest leaders were thrilled about the arrests, not because they believed it would drive meaningful change, but because they thought it would get us on TV. They openly talked about how it was good we were getting media coverage, framing the stunt as a victory. So as I sat there, I realized how selfish and shallow the whole thing felt. New Yorkers needed to use that bridge to get to work or home, and a group of entitled activists decided to block it to make a spectacle about their hatred for Wall Street. It wasn't a real solution or even a meaningful protest. It was a selfish stunt designed for attention. By the time the 2012 election rolled around, I had no enthusiasm for Obama. He and Romney felt like the same candidate to me, 2 sides of the same establishment coin. The allure of Obama as an anti-establishment figure had completely evaporated for me. He was clearly part of the machine and seemed to be enjoying it. He hadn't lived up to his progressive promises, and I was deeply disillusioned. For the first time, I abstained from voting. It felt pointless. By 2016, I had completely lost faith in the Democrat Party. At first, I was excited to vote for Bernie Sanders. I genuinely believed he could bring real change. But watching how the party pushed him out felt like a slap in the face. The leaked DNC emails from Debbie Wasserman Schultz made it painfully clear. The Democrat establishment didn't care about the will of the people. They cared about maintaining power. The blatant corruption and the lengths they went to sabotage Bernie made me question everything I thought I knew about the party I had supported for so long. It should be noted that out the gate, I didn't want to support Hillary Clinton. She felt like part of the establishment. Bush 2.0, a neocon in liberal clothes. And the more I learned about her, the more my perspective on her was reaffirmed. The email scandals and her absolute lack of authenticity, it all added up. Around this time, I started watching Alex Jones on YouTube. At first, it was mostly for entertainment. He was so over the top, and it was such a departure from the polished, scripted narratives I was used to seeing on mainstream television, but I found his perspective intriguing, if only because it offered something completely different from the media bubble I was living in. That said, I was still very anti-Trump at the time. I had fully bought into the media narrative that painted him as a dangerous, unhinged clown. I was working for a small digital company under NBC and Univision, and I was still deeply invested in the left's perspective. At the time, all the propaganda seemed to confirm what I already believed about Trump, that he was a threat. But then I had my first moment of awakening. I remember seeing clips of Trump's speeches on the news, and they looked awful, completely indefensible. But as part of my job, I had to cut a video that required me to watch one of his speeches in full. To my surprise, in context, his words didn't sound nearly as bad as the media had made them seem. In fact, many of the points he made were reasonable, even if I didn't agree with his policies. That was a moment where I started questioning my belief in the media's objectivity. I ended up reviewing several of his speeches, and though I still didn't align with his platform at the time, it became glaringly obvious that this man was being unfairly maligned. The media wasn't just reporting, they were crafting a narrative. Still, I didn't think Trump had a chance of winning. I lived in the New York bubble where everyone treated him like a joke. But then came my second moment of clarity. I had a job performing in a local industrial commercial in South Jersey. I took the train down, and as we drove through South Jersey and Pennsylvania, all I saw were Trump posters. house after house, yard after yard. That moment opened my eyes. Living in New York City, I thought Trump was a clown with no real support, but seeing the overwhelming presence of his campaign in those areas made me realize he had a legitimate shot. When the general election came, I couldn't stomach voting for Hillary Clinton, and I wasn't ready for Trump either. Jill Stein felt like a reasonable ideological compromise, and a way to avoid the inevitable judgment from my New York friends who would label me as a misogynist for not voting for Hillary simply because she was a woman. It was typical liberal posturing and performative logic, but it factored into my decision. Voting for Stein felt like staying true to my conscience. By then, though, it was clear something bigger was happening. The media, the Democrat Party, and the entire establishment weren't telling the whole truth, and for the first time, I was starting to see it. That election night was a major turning point for me, not because of who won, but because of what I witnessed. I took the train to Manhattan, camera in hand, to shoot a short documentary to capture the energy of the moment. I ran back and forth between Rockefeller Plaza, where there was a Hillary Clinton party, and the Fox News building, where Trump supporters had gathered. Both buildings were only a couple of blocks apart. When I got off the train at Rockefeller Center, Trump had just flipped the delegates on Hillary. The mood was surreal, dead quiet. The once buzzing celebration had turned into disbelief, especially among foreign women who seemed genuinely shocked by what was unfolding. Meanwhile, over at the Fox News building, the atmosphere couldn't have been more different. Trump supporters were jubilant, cheering, and smiling, and they were incredibly friendly, completely at odds with the angry, hostile caricature I had seen of them in the media. As the night wore on and Trump's victory became clear, a somber air fell over New York City. The streets felt heavier, almost tense. Dump trucks lined Fifth Avenue near Trump Tower and the hotel where he was set to give his acceptance speech. I went to Trump Tower and caught a glimpse of him leaving for the venue. While most people there were calm and just observing, it was the liberals who were losing it. I saw one blue-haired woman screaming at a man, absolutely losing her mind and trying to start a fight. From Trump Tower, I headed to the hotel where he was giving a speech. The scene outside was fascinating. Dump trucks were parked everywhere, forming a barrier around the venue. You couldn't even cross to the same side of the street as the hotel, but the crowd outside the hotel was celebratory. There were people waving flags, cheering, and even Israeli flags flying in support of Trump, which completely caught me off guard. At the time, the media narrative painted Trump as a literal Nazi, so seeing Israeli flags there didn't make any sense to me. Why would they support someone like that? It was yet another stark reminder that the reality on the ground was so much more complex than the black and white stories I had been fed through the media. Shortly after that, I moved to Los Angeles. For the first couple of years of Trump's presidency, I was still very much opposed to him. I followed Russiagate, though not too closely at first. Honestly, I didn't understand the left's obsession with it. But that constant harping on Trump's alleged collusion with Russia made me lose trust in their ability to offer fair and reasonable opposition. It felt targeted, like they were fixated on tearing him down rather than addressing real issues. Around this time, I was still watching Alex Jones, mostly on his website since he had already been banned from major platforms. I also started listening to Rush Limbaugh, Sean Hannity, Ben Shapiro, and Sebastian Gorka. I was still liberal in many ways, but I was sick of the media's relentless spin about Trump. I was looking for another perspective, something that wasn't entirely focused on demonizing the man. I also started feeling distrustful of the Democrats. It seemed like they were willing to cut off the country's nose to spite its face. The FBI's involvement in Russiagate only deepened my skepticism, making me question the integrity of this country's institutions and how far they would go to target political opponents. My shift to moderate took a sharper turn in 2019 when AOC and the Squad became the face of the Democrat Party. By then, I no longer valued socialist ideas the way I once had. From my experience living in America for over a decade and owning a couple of small businesses, I'd come to see government intervention as more harmful than helpful in most cases. That said, I still thought limited policies like universal health care or UBI could be beneficial. I was still naive in many respects. Now, a series of events pushed me even further away from the left. Hoaxes like the Covington Catholic kids and Jussie Smollett were pivotal moments. Watching the media create and perpetuate these hoaxes in real time was infuriating. It showed me just how willing they were to manipulate the public for a narrative. Brett Kavanaugh's confirmation hearing in 2018 had already planted seeds of doubt. I had questions about the situation, but living in New York and then Los Angeles during the height of the Me Too movement made it impossible to even voice skepticism without risking social exile. It felt like bloodthirsty feminists were ready to destroy anyone who dared acknowledge discrepancies in the stories being told. So when I started sharing some of my more conservative thoughts with friends, I quickly realized how taboo those ideas were in the New York and Los Angeles entertainment circles. Several friends warned me outright if I shared those opinions publicly, I'd never get work. They told me to just keep my thoughts to myself. It reinforced the idea that the left wasn't as tolerant as they claimed to be, especially within the world I was navigating. The fear of being ostracized was real. Then came the pandemic, and everything felt like it was falling apart. I'll be honest, I was deeply frustrated with Trump's handling of certain things, and for a time, I moved back toward the Democrat side. A very personal blow for me was the travel bans. My family's from Brazil, and some of them live in Portugal. So when the bans went into effect, it meant I wouldn't be able to see them for who knows how long. The uncertainty was crushing, and I got really angry at Trump. Not just for that, but for the way the entire situation was handled. The lockdowns were another massive frustration. It seemed like nobody, from Fauci to Trump, knew what the hell was going on. At first, they told us masks didn't matter, then suddenly masks were mandatory. Other protocols kept changing, and every time the lockdowns were extended, it felt like the trust and goodwill I had developed for Trump had completely eroded. By the end of it, I felt like I had reset back to square one, moderate and no longer backing Trump. The George Floyd riots were another baffling and disheartening moment. At the time, I didn't connect the dots that it was primarily Democrat leaders allowing their cities to descend into chaos. Looking back now, it's clear that many of them enabled the destruction, but at the time I put the blame on Trump. Perhaps that's what Democrats wanted, because it felt like the media's constant predictions about Trump leading the country into chaos were finally coming true. It was as if a bizarre nihilistic prophecy hammered down our throats by Democrats and their media allies for years had finally been fulfilled. Needless to say, by the time the 2020 election rolled around, I was in no place to support Trump. I couldn't bring myself to vote for Biden either. The guy was a train wreck, as establishment and corrupt as they come, and genuinely awful. So once again, I abstained from voting. It felt like a choice between two terrible options, and I couldn't align myself with either. Now, something I haven't mentioned yet, but which began playing a larger role in shaping my political identity, is that around 2019, I started developing an online following for the first time. While I wasn't initially open about my political perspective, it slowly became the focus of my commentary online. This evolution tracked closely with my shift from being a moderate who was tolerant of Trump to outright disliking him. That journey culminated with January 6th, which completely destroyed any trust or support I had left for Trump. At the time, I was furious. It felt like the kind of coup I had heard about and seen happen in Latin America, and the idea of something like that occurring in America was deeply unsettling. Now, all that being said, I want to be clear, my views on January 6th have changed significantly since then, as my understanding of the events have evolved, but at the time, I saw that as a breaking point. During this period, I took a much sharper shift back to the left. That shift felt compounded by my growing online audience, which overlapped heavily with figures like H3 and other leftists. This shared audience reinforced my move back toward the left, as their perspectives and commentary aligned with the frustrations I was also feeling at the time. It felt justified to lean into that political space, given the community I was engaging with. As I aligned more with the left, I found myself discussing issues and feeling pressure to adopt perspectives that clashed with my understanding of the world and my personal experiences. While I'm relatively socially liberal and take a laissez-faire approach to how others live their lives, the growing push for child transitions is something I unequivocally reject and find deeply morally disturbing. The idea of irreversible medical decisions for children is abhorrent, and no matter how much I tried to analyze and logically understand the left's position, I couldn't find a single perspective where it was morally sound. Initially, the promotion of LGBT culture in schools and broader society didn't bother me. It seemed harmless. But as I've watched the narrative evolve, it's begun to feel like a means to an end rather than a genuine effort to promote inclusion or understanding. This shift has made me increasingly uncomfortable, raising questions about the underlying intentions behind these efforts and their long-term impact on society and children. At the same time, I started noticing the growing corruption in California, especially in how the state dealt with homelessness. California is and has been run by Democrats for decades, with little to no checks and balances, and the dysfunction was glaring. Homelessness wasn't just a growing problem, it was a crisis that seemed to worsen despite the billions of dollars in resources supposedly being thrown at it. During this period, I also launched a brand new business venture. For the first time, I was running a business outside my home and found myself navigating local bureaucracy. It was an infuriating experience. The hoops I had to jump through, the fees I had to pay, and the endless delays made it clear that Los Angeles County and the state of California had created a system so complex and expensive that it effectively priced out the little guy. This was driven home during a recent meeting I had with a local bureaucrat here in LA who essentially admitted as much. He told me that I was the only small business owner he'd ever met with. His typical meetings were with multi-million-dollar investors and their representatives. What I was asking for wasn't even big, just help clearing a small hurdle in this Byzantine maze of regulations. But even that was nearly impossible to achieve without spending money I didn't have or hiring expensive consultants to navigate the process for me. It became obvious that California's system was designed not to support small businesses, but to centralize power in the hands of the same wealthy elites who loudly virtue signaled about being champions of the little guy. The Democrats running the state have effectively created a system that crushed small businesses while allowing major corporations and rich investors to thrive. For me, it was a stark reminder that the rhetoric of the left often didn't match the reality, especially when it came to policies that were supposedly about equity and fairness. The tipping point for me with Trump, though, ended up being Lawfare. The relentlessness with which the left pursued Trump, even after he left office, pushed me further away from them. It wasn't just the sheer volume of attacks, it was the calculated consistency and coordination. Every Democrat-supported lawsuit across multiple states, every impeachment, every leak, they all felt like part of a broader campaign to take him down at any cost. It stopped looking like accountability and started feeling like a vendetta, a coordinated effort to ensure he could never run for office again. And the more I watched, the more the left started to look like the swamp Trump had warned about. The left has spent years mocking him as a conspiracy theorist for even mentioning it, but their actions proved otherwise. Figures like Fani Willis in Georgia, Alvin Bragg in New York, Letitia James in New York, and Jack Smith at the federal level became the faces of this weaponized justice system. These coordinated efforts didn't come across as fair or impartial. They reeked of political persecution designed to silence opposition and tighten their grip on power. At the same time, Biden's presidency was proving to be an unmitigated disaster. His mishandling of the continued pandemic rollout, the catastrophic Afghanistan pullout, and the Democrats' willingness to play the same dirty tricks they accused Republicans of were glaring red flags. Now, one of the most blatant examples was how the Hunter Biden laptop story was buried during the 2020 election. Learning that the Biden administration had pressured Twitter and other social media platforms to shut the story down while mainstream media either ignored it or dismissed it as Russian disinformation was eye-opening. In retrospect, it was even more disturbing to realize how social media companies had silenced the sitting president, Trump, by banning him from virtually every platform. This coordinated effort to suppress information and control narratives wasn't just about Trump, it was about power and censorship on an unprecedented scale. It shattered any illusions I had about the left being the defenders of free speech or democracy. And the way they weaponized January 6th was also a prime example of this. They used the events of that day to justify unprecedented crackdowns on dissent and opposition, framing it as the worst attack on democracy since the Civil War. Yet in comparison to the George Floyd riots, which caused billions in damages, destroyed entire neighborhoods and left communities in shambles, or the Palestine protest occupations years later, January 6th wasn't even close to the chaos they made it out to be. Unlike the sustained violence and destruction in those other events, January 6th was chaotic but isolated and far less destructive. Also, there's a great amount of evidence that the FBI may have actually been involved in inciting a lot of the action that day. Now, the selective outrage was telling. The same leaders who condemned January 6th as an existential threat to democracy turned a blind eye or outright supported violent riots and occupations that lasted weeks or months. The double standard was impossible to ignore. January 6th wasn't about accountability. It became a tool to consolidate power, silence opposition, and justify sweeping actions against anyone who didn't fall in line with the left's agenda. It was yet another reminder that their concern wasn't about democracy or justice. It was about control. By the time Trump's mugshot was plastered everywhere, it felt like the culmination of years of these tactics. It wasn't just about him, it was about the systemic weaponization of institutions to crush political opposition. Seeing the left celebrate his arrest with such glee, completely ignoring the broader implications of what they were cheering for, was a breaking point for me. It wasn't just unjust, it was a blatant assault on the principles of justice and fairness. That mugshot wasn't just a picture, it was a symbol of how far they were willing to go to silence opposition. And for me, it was the moment I decided enough was enough. Further, it seemed odd, to say the least, that Trump wasn't allowed to share skepticism about the 2020 election. Throughout history, we've had several elections that were highly contested, and questioning their outcomes wasn't just accepted, it was encouraged. The Bush-Gore election in 2000 is a prime example, with the Florida recount dominating headlines and dividing the nation. More recently, Stacey Abrams has openly questioned the results of the Georgia governor's race and continues to claim it was stolen from her to this day. Yet, while Democrats questioning elections is treated as legitimate and even heroic, when Trump or other Republicans do the same, it's labeled as dangerous or undemocratic. The double standard is glaring, and it raises the question, why is skepticism celebrated on one side but condemned on the other? It seemed less about protecting democracy and more about controlling the narrative. But the nail in the coffin of my support for the Democrat Party was Trump's arrest in Georgia. That was the moment I realized just how far they were willing to go to weaponize the justice system against their political opponents. It wasn't just about Trump, it was about silencing dissent and maintaining power at any cost. In response, I designed a t-shirt with his mugshot. this one, and shared for the first time my public support for Trump on September 1st, 2023. It was a way of saying enough is enough. Shortly after, I followed up with a more formal post on X explaining my support for Trump and Vivek Ramaswamy as a potential ticket. For me, this wasn't about tribalism or blindly picking a side. It was about standing up against corruption, calling out the blatant abuse of power, and defending the values I hold dear: fairness, accountability, and justice. Now, from summer 2022 to spring 24, I spent 2 years live streaming 5 to 7 days a week, myself researching, reacting to, and commenting on different political and cultural topics. It was an eye-opening period where I learned more than I ever had about subjects like the pandemic, the development of vaccines, January 6th, the Israel-Palestine conflict, abortion rights, and the ongoing lawfare against Trump. I documented it all on my live streaming channel, sharing my evolving perspective in real time with my small but present audience. During that time, I also created a second channel specifically to dive deeper into cultural topics and explore ideas I typically didn't speak publicly about more openly. It became a space where I could dissect and discuss issues that felt increasingly relevant to the shifting political and cultural landscape. That's what this channel is. Anyway, after that, I took a 6-month break from posting anything online, my longest break since 2016. Until then, I had been posting almost daily. And during the hiatus, I continued to research the Republican movement. And thus, for the first time in my life, I registered as a Republican and voted for Trump in the 2024 election. I knew he couldn't win California because of how Democrats dominate the state, but I wanted to contribute to his popular vote count. I encouraged everyone I spoke with to vote and tried to open their minds to supporting Trump. I even looked for ways to help canvass for him locally here in LA. Initially, I wasn't planning on returning to posting until early 2025, but the day before the election, I felt compelled to act. I wanted to do everything I could to help Trump win, so I decided to post a video outlining why I believed voting for Trump was so critical for the country. I saw this election as a pivotal moment for America. On one side, we had an anti-establishment candidate, someone who had survived 2 assassination attempts and whose policies reflected the values and principles I hold. On the other hand, was a puppet candidate, someone with no real policy, a disastrous track record as vice president, and an even worse reputation in California, where she was deeply unpopular in many parts of the state. Yet, she had been propped up as a Democrat nominee. And so after enduring 4 years of chaos under President Biden and Vice President Harris, I saw no way the country could survive another 4 years of her as president. The stakes felt impossibly high, and staying silent didn't feel like an option. That's why I decided to speak out when I did. Now, throughout my political journey, one thing has remained constant: my principles. I've always believed in the freedom for individuals to live their lives as they choose, and in the importance of equal opportunities for everyone. What has changed over time is my perspective on how to achieve these ideals. At one point, I thought government could play a central role in creating a more equitable society. But I've learned through experience that government policies often have the opposite effect. They fall prey to corruption, inefficiency, and overreach, ultimately hurting the very people they claim to help. This realization led me to prioritize less government involvement and more freedom for individuals. Government should not exist to dictate our lives. Over the years, I've also noticed a stark difference between the consistency of Republicans and the ever-shifting priorities of the Democrats. Progressivism is always chasing the next big thing, but these ideas are rarely new. For example, transgenderism has existed throughout history, dating back to the Romans. What's new is making it a central political issue and extending it to children, turning what should be a cultural conversation into a policy agenda. This overreach has alienated many, including myself. All in all, my political history is complex, but my core values, personal freedom, accountability, and equal opportunity, have never wavered. What's changed is my understanding of how those values can be realized. Today, I believe the best way to achieve them is through policies that limit government interference and empower individuals. Right now, no one embodies this fight better than Trump and the Republican Party. Trump's willingness to stand against the entrenched corruption of the Democrat establishment makes him the candidate best positioned to restore balance and protect the freedoms that make this country great. While my journey has had its twists and turns, it has brought me to a place of clarity. The values I hold dear align most closely with the values and policies being championed by Trump and Republicans today. Anyway, I know that was long-winded. I hope all of it made sense. Thank you so much for watching, and I'm looking forward to what's ahead. Take care.